Hi, my name is Marshall, and this is a video lesson. This is sort of a if you're new to the video lesson format on Waveform, this is just a sort of uncut look at the session that I designed the gun sounds in for Modern Warfare. This is Ableton Live 10. The episode focuses mostly on this design right here, but there's also a couple other things in the session that we'll talk about that were just sort of scattered little designs that I had to do, like the mech layer examples, and here's just where I tested all the gunshots before I started designing and all this other stuff. And I'll actually delete those tracks because I'm not going to save this, and I'd rather save the CPU for this stuff. So yeah, I'm just gonna go track by track. This is a very chill format. I've got a little hot mug of green tea. I'm just gonna riff on all this stuff, and please, in the comments, if you have any questions about anything that I say, then just leave a comment and I'd be happy to get back to you and answer it for you. And also thank you for supporting the Patreon, because if you are watching this, then you are a supporter, which is great. So yeah, like I said, this is Ableton Live 10. I tend to organize my sessions, so this is every design that actually makes it into the Modern Warfare episode. I tend to design my sessions like that, to have one Ableton session for every sound that I make for a particular episode. So this up here, this test playground stuff, this is just like me seeing if different designs will work. This is where, for example, I found the recordings that I wanted to use from the guns pack for the episode. So that's what this is, but we don't have to worry too much about this. And this is the example of realistic to not realistic, all that stuff from the episode. So I'm actually going to delete this track. I'm not going to be saving this session today. And this is the mech layer examples from the episode and the music example, the Snoop Dogg dancing music example. We're going to delete that as well. Yeah, so let's focus on this over here, the full mix. This is the Gunshot design. So I did approach this Gunshot design very similarly to how I explained it in the episode. I approached it layer by layer. As you see, I have kind of organized out every layer here that I mentioned in the episode. I didn't end up using this temp music thing. I just used that to get some context for how the mix actually sounded, and I never really intended to throw that in the episode. It's actually just like a low drone, so we're going to ignore that. Then I did ambience and Foley, which we'll talk a little bit about. The weapon mix, which we'll save for last, I think. The reload, the bullet hits, meaning the hit markers, the kill confirmed GUI, and death vocalization. So if you notice in the episode, I actually do add a little bit of a man screaming in there, which is kind of funny. And then the bullet shells and the bullet whiz-bys. So we'll go through here, and I'll talk about each one a little bit. Let's first reference the original. I'm not sure if my broadcasting software is actually going to show the video reference, but it's kind of boring, and that's all that's going to give us is low frame rate, and it's going to show us the sync. So I'll just play the audio from it, because I'm assuming you've already watched the episode. In fact, you must have watched the episode. So here's the original audio we're working with, and this is the actual design that's in the game.
HQ active. Move to.
So that's our reference point. The first thing that stuck out to me that I kind of knew I wanted to replicate was how just staccato it feels. It's very, like, the shots do not bleed into each other very much at all. They're very individual. You can pick out a single one. You can almost count how many shots you fired. They're that separate. So that was the first thing. That was like the seed of what was inspiring to me about that particular clip. It's actually a silenced weapon in the game, but I didn't mention that in the episode because I thought it would kind of overcomplicate the script a little bit, so I left that out. But my design isn't silenced or anything. It's just a generic gun design at that firing speed. I didn't want to get too much into like the actual make of the gun. That's a whole other realm of accuracy that a lot of sound designers do pursue. I haven't myself pursued that very often, just because the games that I've worked on, like Just Cause 4, for example, hasn't required that kind of a level of detail and accuracy that someone would expect from, for example, a Battlefield game. But yeah, so this, and I think it's a lot of fun to just kind of layer things from different guns together and try to create your own sort of feel. So the ambience and the Foley. This is the first category of the design. I started with just there's a basic transition in the clip. You go from an apartment, like a sort of a wood wall room, to this desert scene. So I just do a simple crossfade here between the two atmospheres. It's not too detailed there. And then the footsteps. So the footsteps, the bottom three tracks here are actually the thing that I mentioned in the episode, the Foley bringing the gun up and down in your line of sight. You guys can hear, I'll show you what the ambient sounds like first as a full track. So you get a lot of shuffling and a lot of sort of backpack jacket leather movement. I was using that to sort of replicate what you'd expect a stereotypical soldier footstep to sound like. You'd expect to hear a little bit of gear and leather or nylon or something like that. So I started with this bed of footsteps. You see we make a transition here when the player exits. We go from a footstep on a wood floor to a boot on dirt. And that's something that I wanted to capture, that little bit of detail. Like you can tell when someone's sort of tried to go for generic footsteps and they haven't taken the time to do surfaces. So I wanted to make sure we get that pretty accurate. The thing about footsteps that I've noticed in the mix, in the actual game, in Modern Warfare, is that the player footsteps, meaning your footsteps as a player, are much quieter than the footsteps of other players, which is, of course, for gameplay reasons. I think it's great. But if the same way that if you were in a role-playing game, you might bump up the character's footsteps because they're the most important footsteps. Like if you're playing World of Warcraft or something and you wanted the player to hear their footsteps, but it didn't really matter exactly if you could hear the other, the NPCs around you walking around. So it's the opposite in Call of Duty, where you're where you are just by looking at your screen, so it's not that important to hear your footsteps. But when you're talking about trying to locate enemy players, it's very important. So that's the footsteps. There's also, like I said, these three tracks down here, which I love. One of the sounds I love designing, I don't know why that is, but designing the sound of someone pulling a gun up to their line of sight and back down is so fun to me. It's just like a very subtle little shake of like a metallic object. I don't know, it just feels good. So this is so load. This is that layer. So it's kind of a leather feel, but it's yeah, I don't know how to describe it. It's just it's strange because it's kind of an abstract sound. There's no world in which you'd pull a gun up, like just moving a gun makes something shake like that. It's a very unrealistic sound, but it's an important sound for communicating to the player, the preciseness of their action and stuff. So it's very, like, if you pulled the left trigger to pull up the gun to your line of sight and no sound came out, it would be very strange. So you kind of have to toe that line of, I was looking for samples that very easily could have sounded like part of a reload on this gun, or part of moving around a magazine on this gun and accidentally hitting part of the side of the gun. But there's no way to go realistic because it's just not a realistic sound. It wouldn't happen in real life. And one thing I do, if I can't seem to find a sound that feels realistic enough, and I think I did this on these as well. Yeah, I did. So I pitched them up 9 semitones. So the samples actually sound like this, without the pitching. It's a little too clunky. Like, to me, that sounds like a machine gun being pulled up to your eye. But the gun is a lot smaller and was a lot faster than that, so I pitched them up. And then you just get that little extra bit of precise, it feels more like a soldier who's trained to use this weapon really effectively. So yeah, that's one trick that I do. I mean, it's not a trick that's even specific to just this particular style of sound design, this particular sound of line of sight, but it's something that you can do very often, is pitch something up to reduce the size, or pitch something down to make something sound bigger. So I wanted to make this sound smaller and faster, so I pitched these up. Yeah, so that's the Foley layer. Foley and ambience layer comes together again to sound like this in the end. The samples are a combination of cloth by a sound effect, his cloth Foley library, and then also the gun handling sounds from Sound Effects Monkey. So again, I mentioned in the episode that guns was the pack that I used to make the guns. Gun handling is the pack that I used to make the gun handling sounds in this episode as well. So now let's skip over the weapon mix. Like I said, we can save that for the end because there's the most information about that I have to talk about. And I want to talk about the bullet hits and the reload. So again, these are two more sounds that I love designing. In the episode, the reload is very simple. In the episode, I talk about how the new Call of Duty game has gone from, we just had Advanced Warfare, all these very futuristic games, Infinite Warfare, that were like set in space. They had tons of sci-fi elements to them. The reload sounds in that game, no doubt, had tons of layers. But the new game is very much, it's much more realistic and gritty. And the reload sounds reflect that. The reload sounds are much more, they feel like just single recordings. So I tried to go for that and I tried not to layer anything at all on this reload sound, which I admit was pretty hard. So this is actually just straight up, no pitch changes. The gun handling assault rifle, the SCAR reload sounds from Sound Effects Monkey. And I love that. And it's got a little reverb. You're going to hear a little bit of reverb from the entire processing chain on this. Actually, I could turn it off, but I'll show you. I'll do that later. So yeah, that sound worked really well for me because I kind of like the when I'm working on a gun and I want to and for example, the gunshot itself kind of sounds over the top and bombastic and really unbelievable. I like to give that a realistic reload sound. I think that's a really cool sort of juxtaposition because if the player shoots this crazy gun and it sounds almost like a kick drum, it sounds, nothing like a real gun would, and then they reload the gun and the reload sounds super realistic, it kind of balances it out and it lets you get away with a little bit more because the player, if they were going to say, oh, this gun sounds nothing like real life, then they hear the reload and it kind of pulls back a little bit. It's like, well, the gunshot may sound crazy, but we're going to give it a realistic reload and it's going to cement everything. It's going to put it back into place. So I kind of I think getting away with a realistic reload, or rather I think using a realistic reload helps you get away with murder with the gun because you can design it however you want. If the reload sounds good, then you can convince anyone that a gunshot could be real. So that's why I like to do that with the reload, and that's why I approached it that way for this episode. The bullet hits. So in the episode, I think I basically say, and this is totally not true anymore because it was true for the first design, but then I redesigned the sound, I think, in between recording the script and the episode. So there's a little bit of a inaccuracy in the episode, which is that I say it's made with a kick drum and white noise, which is true. I think there's part of a layer of kick drum and white noise in this, but there's also this gore proc sound, which I found and just had to use because I loved it. Gore proc. It's by the Soundkeeper. So this is, when I heard this, I was like, okay, I bet I can make a better bullet impact sound with this sound with gore. Let's see if I can find the original sample with gore. Yeah, so I heard that and I was like, you know what, I have to redesign my bullet impact sound. And I knew I wasn't going to go for something that realistic, but I do like where I ended up, which is this sort of very deep, low clicking sound. It's like, it has a lot of low end to it, as you can see from the EQ, but it also just cuts through the mix like butter. I mean, it's got this high, kind of like white, noisy, clicky sound. I just think it's great. And this is the kind of sound where you can iterate and iterate and iterate. Like, you can really take this, like, for example, what my workflow on something like this would look like is I would have, I probably would save this up here just so I could know the timing, just so I could know exactly when I was going to put the three hits. But then I would mute this and then I'd say, okay, here's my sample. What don't I like about it? What do I like about it? Well, what if I pitch it up to, pitch it up 6 semitones? What does that sound like? And then if I like that, I go, okay, great. And then I just duplicate the track out again, drag my sample over, save this, and now I'm working fresh again. I'm working from scratch on a new track. And then I go, okay, well, what if I actually wanted to add some, compression to it now? It's getting a little bit more kind of like high-endy, a little bit more snappy. Change it to mono maybe. No, I like it stereo. It's a little bit more in your face. It's panning a little bit right to make up that difference of whatever's happening on the. Yeah, so what I like to do on these kinds of sounds, because you're not trying to preserve realism, or because you're not trying to, slowly massage anything into a particular sound, you're really just like experimenting, and it's a lot of fun. So I like to duplicate tracks, drag things over, and just save my progress and just watch a sound evolve over time. And then, for example, like on iteration number 4, if I like something, then I'll just record it onto a new track, take the sample over here, and then time it with my original reference. So I can go, okay, here's my new sound. I'll just time it with the original, sub it out, and then like listen to how it sounds. And then I go, okay, well, I like that more, or I like that less. And then if I like it less, I just delete these tracks, and here I am starting over again from a good place. So that's the way I make these kinds of sounds. I consider it a GUI sound. There's a few, it's kind of like a hard thing to align to toe, because it's a bullet impact sound. Like, for example, the death notifier sound, this sound that I'll talk about coming up in a sec. That's very obviously a GUI sound. It's very obviously something that couldn't be happening in the world of the game. But the bullet hit sound is much more ambiguous, because we're going for, like I said, the old Call of Duty hit marker, GUI sound, very obviously. It's a white noise click. No one's like thinking, oh, where's the sound coming from? Because it's obvious that it's telling the player something. But again, Modern Warfare, the new Modern Warfare is taking it more to a realistic place. So it could be a bullet impact, it could be a GUI sound. So it toes the line, and that affects rather the way you decide to do things like stereo spread. For example, this sound is very wide. It has a lot of difference in the left and right channel, and it's not mono. Mono, this would sound like this. Hear how much wider it is than that. So for a sound like this, the stereo field being wide like that, I kind of think is my way of suggesting to the audience or to the player that this is in fact a GUI sound. But even though it sounds realistic, it's going to play at this perspective all the time, and it's going to have this level of clarity all the time. So if, for example, I did make it mono, and I placed it and I put reverb on it, and I put it more in the space of the level, then it might be confused for an actual bullet impact on a body. But again, I want to push the gunplay feel. I want to make the player feel like they're, like, every time they get consistent satisfaction from connecting a shot. So the only way to really do that consistency, or to have that consistency, is to treat it more like a GUI sound in the way that it's mixed. So I like stereo spread on sounds like that. Especially because, guns, relatively speaking, fall mostly in the center most of the time. So having that stereo spread, again, helps me separate this sound, because this is guaranteed, again, to be playing over constant gunfire. So there's like a huge sound that's already playing that's very important, that we don't want to just duck to put this sound in. So yeah, I like the idea of having it be separate, not only in the way that it sounds, but also in the way that it's spread in the stereo image. So that's one thing that I'll do to separate that. I hope that makes sense. So like, if your gun's in the center, basically I'm looking for every variable possible to make this bullet hit sound what I want it to be, but also have it be different enough from the gunshot that it'll be obvious that they're not the same sound. Because trying to layer like a blip, kind of like a white noise crack sound like this over a gunshot, like if you don't take every measure possible to try and separate them, you're gonna get they're just going to dissolve into the gunshot. It's going to sound like oatmeal. It's going to be like, you know, you're not going to be able to tell which is which or hear the difference. So yeah, this coming up next, the kill confirm GUI sound and the death vocalizations. This guy screaming, this death sound effects, I'll just mute for now because I want to talk more about the GUI part of it. But yeah, this is what it sounds like all the way through. I'm going to just mute this guy while we talk about the actual design. Although there's some kind of processing in this that I thought was cool. The original sound sounds like this. So I thought that was this sample, it's a little too close for me. It's a little too like, not in a space. So I use this plugin. I like this plugin a lot. It's called Proximity. It is by, who's it by? I don't know. It doesn't say on the plugin. I kind of forget. But check it out. You can Google Proximity VST and you'll find it. Basically what this plugin does is it's like a distance adder. I know that sounds weird, but you basically turn the only buttons I really even press on it are true gain and the slider. What it does is it starts default at 0 and you can add distance to it. So you just add minus 24 meters and you just or minus 5 meters, and it really does just make something sound distant. I'll show you. I'll turn it on and I'll loop the sound and then slowly move the dial back. I use 2 back to back because sometimes I like more distance than the plugin has to offer, but I'll show you right now what it sounds like as they both go back. It's very subtle, but I love it. It's kind of like a lot of sample packs, particularly of human vocalizations, because they were recorded very close to the mouth of the person. They sound very close, and if you put them in a game, it's going to sound like you're running around in the desert, you know, having a gunfight with somebody, and then they walked right up. It's going to sound like they're right next to your ear when they cough, which is not what we want. We don't want we don't want to take the player out of the experience like that. So I use this plugin to make something sound like if it was on a mic. Now it's like 20 feet away from a mic, which I think is great. Then I added some slapback delay onto the cough, just to make it sound like it was bouncing off of the buildings a little bit more, which I think helps a lot to push the sound back into the mix a little bit more. Then the rest of these sounds, like I said in the episode, were sort of resampled metallic hits, explosion sounds, cinematic metal impacts, and sort of like this gory thwacking sound, which I really liked. This sound. I love that. So that's a layer on top. That's supposed to be like the gory kind of suggestion that you've killed the guy. So it's kind of morbid, but it's really, I kind of love it. Then we have this metal impact, which is just the low thump. It's taking care of the lows of this sound. Then we have what I basically did was I took I know this says 47 audio. It's been resampled a bunch, but I took this sound, which is kind of it's actually from the bullets pack. It's actually a bullet impact, one of these bullet impacts from Sound Effects Monkey that's on sale for the episode. It's a metallic hit from that. And then what I did was just sort of add a reverb, take out all of the lows, and then I removed the transient. So it's kind of just the metallic shimmery stuff at the end. And then what we get is kind of a nice little sweetener for this GUI sound. Then we have this, which is a similar thing actually. Sorry, my phone just went off. It's a similar thing to that. I think it's another bullet impact, but it's sort of the transient of the sound. It's not there for the shimmery tail. It's just there to do the original metallic on hit or onset. It's kind of like, to me, the first thing that I thought of when I wanted to do this sound was the classic like cartoon sound effect for when like a character takes out an anvil and like hits someone over the head with it, or like when an anvil falls from the sky and like in Roadrunner and then it hits the coyote on the head, like that kind of thing. So I thought I was looking for bullet impacts and like cinematic metal hits that really had that feel, and I found this, and this was like my first sample that I threw down for this, and I love that. I think it's great. So this sounds like this. All four layers together sound like this. It was actually a while before I added the low explosion. I didn't know if it was going to be too much, because like I said, in the episode, this is one of those sounds that's guaranteed to be playing over gunfire. So I thought maybe that adding a low explosion like that, or like a low thundery sound, would be a little too much, and it would just like muddy things up after the kill. And I thought that would be not satisfying. So originally I left it out, and then because and especially if you compare, like in Overwatch, for example, their hit marker is like all highs. It's like that beer can opening sound. Like that's all, like they don't add any low end into that at all. So I was like, maybe I'm kind of wrong adding an explosion to this, but I put it back in the clip, and I can show you guys in the context of the clip, what it sounds like. It just was not doing it for me. I was like, I'm missing something in the kill confirmed, and I think it's just the lows. So this is what it sounds like without the low explosion. And here's with. I love that. I as soon as I added it, I was like, okay, this is way better. But it kind of goes against my typical rules of mixing, which is that it's like a low sound playing over another low sound. So I don't know. It's one of those things that I can't explain why I liked it more, but I just ended up doing it because what I was doing felt really flat. I guess that's kind of a little lesson for, if you tend to design the same way a lot. If you tend to design the same things the same way, it's good to remind yourself that, it's not always ideal to go with just something that you're used to, as opposed to just using your ear and saying, normally I wouldn't add this sound, but because I'm kind of feeling that the episode is falling a little, or the design is falling flat, I'm going to add this little low explosion. I think that's something that I often have to do is zoom out and say, here's how I actually hear it. And that was one of those cases right there. So the shells and the whiz-bys, I'll show you what this layer sounds like. Pretty self-explanatory. The bullet whiz-bys are something I wasn't sure if I was going to add, because normally you reserve bullet whiz-bys for players shooting at you in a first-person shooter. Like, for example, you would hear if someone was aiming at you and they fired a shot over your head, you'd hear this, but you wouldn't hear it going down range at someone else. But I do think that it adds a nice little texture to the actual gunshot, and it makes a difference when you listen to it with the bullet hits. I think it adds a lot. I think it maybe like this, just because it's in the bullet whiz-by category, makes it seem like it's a little bit out of place, because bullet whiz-bys are normally for other players. But I think I could easily have put this in the gunshot layer or in the bullet hits layer and made it a gooey sound or something like that, and had it just work as a layer in those designs. I think it just adds a nice little, I just like the sounds of like reverse stuff, and that's kind of what these are. It just adds a little bit more texture, and especially when you've got the bullet impact sounds, I think it leads into them nicely, where sort of before you hear a bullet impact, you hear the bullet whiz, and it tells the player like, okay, that was the bullet. Like the bullet is traveling at X speed, and then it hits the guy, and then it makes that sound. So that's why I added it. It's not you could deal with that. You could go with or without it, but I like the sounds of bullet whiz-bys layered in with gunshots, so I did keep it. Then the shells are self-explanatory. That's almost just like that could almost be in the Foley category. It's just simple shell drop onto wood. Okay. Now let's talk about the weapon mix. So here is the weapon mix. I'll actually turn back on the proximity and the reverb onto the whole thing, just so we can hear what the weapon sounds like in context. I'll also turn off the other layers that we already explained. So the first thing that I did like in the beginning of the episode, I showed you what the tracks up in the top left look like, the test playground tracks. Basically, the first thing that I did was go through my effects library, go through the sounds that Asbjorn sent me from Sound Effects Monkey from a sound effect, and I listened through for the guns that seemed to have a similar fire rate as the gun in the clip. And the gun that I settled on, and the gun recordings that are used in this episode, are from the SMG HK, the MP5 submachine gun. So HK MP5. This was the fire rate that I felt matched the closest to the gun in Call of Duty that he's using in this clip. I actually couldn't find. I don't know much about the make and model of different weapons, but the weapon that I found in the episode that's actually in the video clip, which doesn't appear in this clip, so I forget it. I won't be able to find it. But I don't think it's a real. It's not a real gun. So I wasn't going to go, like, for example, if I was doing this for an AK, I wasn't going to be able to just go to an AK pack. So I had to find another weapon that closely modeled it, or that closely matched the fire rate. So I settled on this, the HK MP5. The recordings for this weapon are fantastic. I just spent, I think, basically the first day of this design just listening to all these recordings and going through and saying, okay, here's my favorite. And some of these aren't lit up because I use Soundly for a lot of it too. I use a program called Soundly to organize and listen to my samples. But I literally just listened through all of these and decided, okay, here's the kind of perspective I'm going for on the close. And here's the kind of perspective I'm going for on the distant. And that's where I started. The sub I added later and the mech I added later. I'll talk about that. But the body of the close gunshot is actually not just one close gunshot recording like this. It's a bunch layered on top of each other. I'll mute the tail for now. It's a bunch layered on top of each other, and they sound like this. Oh no, that's what this. No. Oh yeah, the sub is off. Okay, I'll turn the sub off. So I wanted to go for, like I said, a really staccato feel. And I really loved, this is the sample that I think does the most lifting, is this right here. The SMG HK MP5 suppressed 9mm long bursts. Sennheiser 416 is the mic that was used to record this close perspective. If you actually hear, I'll talk about this more in a second, but this is a cool little thing. You kind of hear it going like, you kind of hear it like phasing in and out with its volume. That's because I have auto pans on all these tracks, and I'll talk about that more in a sec. They're tremolos on each track. I'll talk, like I said, that's going to be why you're hearing the difference, but listen to it without it. So I turned that on for all these tracks, but I'll explain, like I said, more about that in a second. So this is the perspective that's doing the most heavy lifting. I think it's a great little, it has mechanical qualities to it, but it's not quite so bright that I couldn't add mechanical sounds on top of it. So when I heard this, I was like, okay, here's my bass. And then I knew that I just wanted to pepper in a little bit more detail here and there. Like, for example, I wanted this low mid thump that I added. Here's another perspective. And at this point, the way I'm designing this is I'm just going through saying, okay, here's my recording. What am I still missing? What do I want to get out of this layer, and where can I find it, and how can I do it? So I put this down first. Then I go, okay, I'm still missing this kind of like low mid-range around 240 hertz. How can I add that back? And then I go through, find other samples that sort of fit that a little bit better, EQ them to bring out their best traits, and then I add them in. So for example, then I added this layer, which is a nice little, like, it's not quite the sub layer, but it's a low thump that kind of like blends the transition between the sub layer and the close layer. Then I also have this little click in the beginning to help aid the first shot. It's like the trigger pull. So that's like, before you hear anything, you're going to hear that. Then we have this perspective, which is the, it's another kind of like low mid perspective, but with a lot more highs. That's kind of like a really, I love that. It's kind of like vowel-y. It has a nice, like, it sounds like someone's like popping with their mouth. They're like, and again, auto pan on this. I'll talk about the auto pan in a second. And then we have this distant, long bursts, kind of like high end sprinkle on top without the tail, cut off the tail. So that I love. Then we have the tail, which is two tails. It's the handgun tail from a Glock, which I think has a really cool onset. I love the onset of this tail. And then the longer tail of a M16 single shot, which is just your standard white noise fade out tail, which I love. So these two together, the tails together sound like this. I often find that I have to layer my tails because tails that have a great like white noise wind kind of like afterburn to them, I love, but they don't often have really great ripping onsets, which I also love. So I often find that I have to layer two tails together to get that combo, which is what I did here. Full close layer again sounds like this. So auto pan, why did I add tremolo to all these layers? Well, it's kind of something that I learned in electronic music when I was making dubstep music and heavy bass music. And it's a technique that I would use on my drums, which is that when you're working in the computer on a grid with samples that are repetitive and playing after each other, one after the other, very, very quickly in succession, there's a struggle to keep variety, like maintain variety. While like every shot has to sound unique while also sounding the same, which is kind of something it's really hard to like learn how to do that balance at first. And I struggled with it for a long time with my drums. So I would end up making a snare drum, and then in the verse of a song, I liked it the first time I heard it, and then 2 days later when I was still making the song, I couldn't stand the snare drum, and I was like, man, I've listened to the snare so many times, it's grating on my ears. I need more variety. I need to feel like every time I hear the snare drum, it's like it's a little bit different. So this is something that I came up with to sort of serve myself a different combination of layers every time. So these auto pans, which I mean they're called auto pans, that's the plugin title, but really what it is a tremolo, increasing and decreasing the volume at a constant rate on a sine wave pattern. So if you notice, this one's at 7.4 hertz, this one's at 9.96 hertz, this one's at 8.33. They're all at different, they all have different speeds. So what it basically means is that every single shot that you hear in this weapon is going to have randomly a different combination of the volume of all of these close layers. So in one, you could get 100% this shot and nothing from these, which would be rare. It'd be kind of hard to get that. But then in the next shot, you could have 70% this, and then, 100% this, 80% this, 5% this. So it's kind of this way, it's kind of like adding a layer of like video game processing to this whole gunshot sound, which is that I'm actually going in and allowing randomness to take over. And I love it for drums. I love it for this. Most of the time with drums, I wouldn't do 100% amount on this randomness, but I kind of loved it in this. I don't know why. It's a really weird sound. It's kind of has like a chaotic feeling to it, but I thought that lended itself well to the gun, and it comes together again to sound like this. So every shot, although, let me turn all of the auto pans off and I'll show you what this sounds like with no auto pan, no tremolo on any of the tracks. Every shot sounds good, but every shot sounds the same. So again, here it is with all the auto pans off, or all the auto pans on. Every shot is different, and they all have a different characteristic to them, but yet they all have the same DNA. So I love that effect. It's something that I do a lot in sounds like this: gunshots, drums, anything that plays repeatedly, but it's kind of made up of layers that can be set to different volumes, and it's all going to contribute to the same thing. Like in drums, for example, you're also layering things that sound similar. So that kind of works for these kinds of sounds. I haven't found much more use for that technique in other things, but like I said in the Portal Gun episode, I love tremolo and I use it all the time. So then we have on the body of the gun, we have some post-processing. We have just this is just a gain. I don't think this limiter is being used. And then we have an OTT compressor, which stands for over the top, and it's an Ableton preset, but it's also like a well-known preset from other multiband compressors. I think it goes back to hardware days. I'm not quite sure about the history of OTT, but it's kind of a producer's tool. It gets coined as being this thing. It gets the reputation of being this kind of like effect that you can use to make anything sound more full. And that is kind of what it is, because essentially what it does is compress to hell everything in a sound. If I added 100% OTT, I'll show you what the difference sounds like on this body layer. So here's body layer without OTT. And here's body layer with 100% OTT. It literally brings out the most volume of every part of a sound, and it just squashes it to hell, which is so... I mean, it's so rare that you would use OTT at 100% dry wet, but I like to use it at like 20% or like 10%, and I think it just adds a little bit of vibrance to the whole vibrance to the whole sound, because it's evening things out a little bit more. And if you design like I do, which is often chaotically, then there are times when I frequently have trouble making things sound like they all came from the same source. So this is one of those ways that you can balance out the frequencies that you add together with it's kind of like pushing everything into a sandwich. It's like taking all the ingredients that you have, and this is like compressing them down and pressing the sandwich together and really making it into a solid block. So here's the sample. Here's the layer again without OTT, and then I'll move it up to 20% for the second time through. Subtle, but definitely a difference. It's I just like it. It kind of occupies the same part of my brain that saturation does when I'm talking about like effects that I use to bring cohesiveness to sounds. Let's talk about the sub layer now. Sub layer is just a kick drum, straight up 808 kick drum with the transient rolled off. I didn't like the transient. If you listen to the transient, it's a little sharp. I didn't want to even mess with the transients, because I knew that I was going to have a sharp transient in the mech layer and in the body layer. So I was like, who cares? I don't need that from the sub. Basically, this is just a 808 kick drum put through a saturator for some high end. Sounds pretty boring without the saturator. I kind of like to have, again, this is another electronic music trick. Sub bass very often sounds way too isolated. If you're mixing it, if it's just a sine wave like these 808 kick drums are, it sounds too much like it's synthesized. So one thing that people do that I do all the time that I love is just driving it with a saturator and bringing some high frequencies back into it. As you can see here, I shelved out the highs a little bit. I brought them up, even though there's like none. And then I put it through a saturator. Sine shape it a little bit. Just this again, like I said, adds that high element that you're hearing, that little bit of extra ear tickle, and it kind of puts some of the information of the lows into the highs. So whenever you're listening to the sound, it feels more cohesive. It feels like all the sounds came from the same place. So that's what I did on the kick drum. As you can see, I manually spaced these. they're kind of like sloppy, but it gets the job done. And with the body layer, the kick drum, the sub and the body layer together sound like this. So sub, again, I wanted hitting around 60 hertz. It's different for every gun, but I tend not to go lower than like 60 or 40 at the lowest. I don't want almost any information below there. As you can see, I've even high passed this below 60. It just gets so muddy after that, and like I don't feel like I don't feel like I can control any sub base that's like below 40. I think like between 80 and sometimes even 100, and then all the way down to 40 is where you want that sub bass kicking for a kick drum, or for a gun. Sub and body together. Okay, so now let's talk about the mech layer. The mech layer, like I say in the episode, is it's all about flavor. It's all about how you're going to, what you want to convey to the player with the information, and what you want to tell the player about the weapon that they're holding. So I opted for, I know in the episode I gave the example of, do you want the player to feel like they're shooting a bag of nuts and bolts that are held together with duct tape, or do you want them to feel like they're shooting a futuristic weapon, an expensive futuristic weapon? I opted for, if like 1 is nuts and bolts and 10 is the sci-fi thing, I opted for like a 2 or a 3, where it doesn't quite feel like it's falling apart, but there is still definitely an element of metal in there. It's not a futuristic weapon. It's very much like a real weapon. So what I did was took this sample from the MP5 close recordings from Sound Effects Monkey, and I used that as my starting point for the mech. As you see, I really have rolled off everything below like 1 kilohertz in this. This is just like strictly high-end pop, and that's kind of what I think of as a mech layer, is something that exists above like 500 hertz. Yeah, it's not, if I would never put, for example, like a low thumping sound in the mech layer. It's just too hard to control. I would much rather go to the sub layer and just design my own thing there, and then have that be the entire bass, because with highs you can get away with mixing things a little bit more, because there are more frequencies that that you can use. There are more bands that you can have control over. But with the lows, like I don't want any sub bass in my mechanical layer. It's just too much. It's too hard to control. So this is kind of like the reference point for the rest of the mech. And then the rest of the mech is just this other layer. Actually, let me show you what the mech layer sounds like in full. So this is my reference point, and then the detail layer and the fun layer is on top, which is this gun handling assault rifle thing, also from Sound Effects Monkey. This is like chaotic, and it's not timed. So I have a timed element to the actual gunshot, and then an untimed element that's chaotic on top of it. Here's what this layer sounds like soloed. And if you notice, it kind of has like a cadence to it. It's like, it kind of has an interest to it. In a real game, if you were to implement this, you could do this as a layer on. For example, if you implemented this into a game and you had each individual gunshot just sitting here timed out on the timeline, if you weren't doing it based on loops, then you could add a random container of all of these samples, these 12 samples or whatever this is here. You could add these into a container and then just say, okay, after every gunshot, play a random one of these at a random time, within like 100 or 200 milliseconds of the original gunshot. That would be a cool way to do it. But because I was working with loops, I kind of just chaotically, this looks like this, these samples are all timed out like this. And I just took a ton of them and lined them up like this. This is like gun handling. This is just moving around magazines, moving around slides on an assault rifle. And I just wanted to sort of spray the mechanical layer with this little detail. So that's what it sounds like. It's kind of a cool, it's a cool vibe for a gun. It's very, like I said, on the closer side to the nuts and bolts than it is to the futuristic weapon. But like I said, if you wanted to like turn this into a futuristic weapon, the way I did it for the episode was I just didn't use any layers like this. I took a layer like this and I put a chorus effect on it. I love this chorus effect in Ableton. There's a preset called Plus that I love. So this is how I did it in the episode. If you wanted to turn this futuristic, you could just have your mech layer be this into a chorus, and you'd get something cool. tons of creative stuff you can do with mech layers and futuristic weapons, but like I said, I wanted to go more realistic, more gritty. So this is how I chose to do that. The mech layer with the body and the sub sounds like this. I'll show you what the entire weapon sounds like again. And I'll do a little mix and match. I'll play everything without the sub, everything without the body, everything without the mech. Here's without the mech. Here's without the body, just mech and sub. Here's just without the sub. Here's the whole thing. Cool. So that's the weapon mix. Now I want to talk a little bit about post-processing on the entire weapon mix as a whole, just everything that's on the group track, and then I want to talk about everything that's on the full mix track. There's a slew of effects that are on the entire thing, and this is kind of one of those things that I'll talk about the mix, and I'll talk about how I try to replicate the mix from a game. So on the weapon mix, this red track here, I have a saturator. This is a 13%. It's dry wet. It's a very small effect. It's literally just here to add a little. Actually, you know what? Before I dive into this, I'm going to disable all these and just show you one by one what it sounds like as we turn them on. Okay, and I'll turn off the full mix stuff too. Wide ambience, get that off there. Okay, so first we have a bit warmer, which is the saturator. Here's what the weapon sounds like, by the way, without it. Now I'm going to add the saturation. Basically, what this does is just like almost all the effects that we had on in the portal gun thing at the end of the portal gun lesson. We were talking about just how to make everything sound like it's part of one thing. So that's what I like saturation for that a lot, and also it just makes it more distorted, which is kind of sweet. So I like that. Get a little bit warmer, as the preset would tell you. Restore punch. This is a preset that I have a love-hate relationship with. It's a multiband compressor preset, and basically what it attempts to do is add more dynamic range to an attacky sample, like drums, for example. As you can see, it's the attack and release is set pretty. The attack is set pretty low, and then the release is set pretty high on these two bands, which is going to give us kind of like a wobbling effect, or like a suction effect. And I've only turned it on to about 25%, so I'm not trying to overwhelm the sound with like a bunch of gating or anything with this multiband compressor, but I do want to like after I've saturated something, I think it's nice to just, because the saturator very often reduces the dynamic range of a bunch of sounds that are squished together. So what I wanted to do with this restore punch was just to get a little bit more of that back. So here's what it sounds like without, and then with. Just brings out some of that low mid thwack, like the ebb and flow of that low mid, just going. So I liked it, and I kept it. OTT, same thing we just talked about, 16%. Bringing out the highs, not much else. EQ8, this is where I looked at the profile. I looked at the actual EQ of the original. If you listen to the original, and I took screenshots of this, and I was just looking at where the actual frequencies were hitting. That's something I did in the portal gun thing as well. I looked at the original, just see where we see the peaks and the troughs and the valleys in the actual EQ, and then I tried to replicate that a little bit with this EQ. I tried to get, like for example, I had a peak at around 600 hertz that I wasn't loving. My sound was too knocky, like this, and I was like, okay, that's not what I want, so I took it out. So that's how I kind of approach EQ. I do have a lot of the time on like these heavily layered sounds, I do throw an EQ on at the very end and try to shape it up more. I do this technique that I saw on the internet one time called search and destroy, which is that I'll sweep through a sound and listen to it as I take this band up and down, and I'll listen for things that sound horrible. Like I'll listen for the really the harshest parts of this, the parts that I'm like, ooh, I don't want that in my gun. And then I'll take it and I'll just pause it there, and I'll just take the gain down a little bit, and I'll just say, okay, there we go. So I fixed it. So that's what I did here. And then, just very subtle things like this band 7. I don't know what that was, just a little thing that I didn't like. Then slightly brightening things up, and then didn't really do much to the lows. So that's what the EQ does. Here's what it sounds like with and without. Not much difference, but it's important. Everything's important. Now we have these two sidechain compressors. This is what I mentioned in the episode as something that you could do in a game to make things sound more clear. Basically what this does is takes volume information, or takes like the amplitude of another track, and it uses that amplitude to inform how much it's compressing the track that the compressor's on. So right now I have two sounds that I think are more important than this gun sound in this mix, which is the kill confirm GUI and the bullet hits. So I want the bullet hits and the kill confirm GUI to send their volume to this track, to tell this track to turn itself down and compress. So, well, not turn itself down, but it compresses the track to a volume that's lower. So what this sidechain does, sidechain from kill confirm GUI, is audio from kill confirm GUI and death vocalizations, takes the audio post effects, and then it uses that information to bring the audio down to this threshold, or compress the audio down. So turned on, it sounds like this, and you'll see it activate when it comes online, when the kill confirm GUI plays. So you hear how the gunshot at the end there gets really compressed, like it feels like it's getting squashed. That's because information's coming from this channel that this sound is playing, and so it ducks this down. That's part of the reason probably why I was able to get the low explosion sound in the kill confirm GUI to actually sound okay, is because the lows from this are getting squashed when it plays. Now I have the same thing from the bullet hit GUI. It just takes the information, it sidechains it's basically, this works the same way that that music example that I did in the episode does. And it's not something that I would typically do in a linear project like this, where I'm working to a video. It's something that it's like emulating the same way that you would do it in a game. So I kind of wanted to try it out just to see if I could get it to sound okay. Because, in this, for example, I wouldn't do that in something like this, because I could just hit A and automate this track and just say, okay, hey, can you turn this? I could pick specifically how much I wanted to turn the volume down just by automating, which is more manual, and you get more control over something like that, which is why I would have chosen that over the compressor if I were doing this for film. Wooden room. So this is just an attempt at emulating the reverb in the room that the guy starts off in the clip. It's just a simple wooden room preset that I tweaked a little bit to have the decay time a little bit lower. I think originally the decay time was set to like 2 seconds, which was like way too much for me. I'll show you what the reverb sounds like on everything at 100%. So that decay time was like way too bombastic for me, and I brought it down more to like this. And I kind of like that. I kind of like the claustrophobia of that like small room gun reverb sound. I think that's one thing that's like super cool in games, is when they have like really great small room reverb tails for gunshots. I know Red Dead did it so well. Like when you're in a bar or something and you fire a gun, the reverb tail on the gun is so scary. It's not like you don't hear the reverb tail outside or anything. You don't hear like a long tail. It's just like this very sharp, reverberated, scary sound, which is like, I think it's really cool when games go to that level of detail for the tails. So yeah, that's again added at about 5%. Here's what it sounds like at about 5%, which is what it is in the episode. I like to just bring reverb up in dry wet until I can just barely hear it. I don't want to overwhelm the sound with reverb. I think that's one of the beginner mistakes that I used to make a lot, and it's a beginner mistake that I think a lot of people make, just adding too much reverb to things, because reverb sounds great, and like you overestimate how much you overestimate how much you need to make the gun sound like it has reverb on it. You don't really need that much. Cool. So then last but not least, I have this little utility. This is used to make the effect that I talk about in the episode, which is that the first shot is going to be like 5 to 6 dB louder than the rest. It's just a cool effect. It's what makes the gun feel punchy every time you fire that first shot. So it really feels like, okay, it goes from silence to shooting, and it's very powerful. But then if you kept things at that volume the whole time, it would be really, really like just terribly exhausting as a player to listen to that over and over again at that volume. So one thing that games will do is they make the first shot about 5-6 dB louder, and then gradually over the course of the first couple shots, it goes back down to a manageable mix level, and a manageable hearing level. So here's what it sounds like off and then on. Cool. Yeah, so wrapping up, now we just have the full mix, which I added a little bit of wide ambience on, and this, like I said, like for the last reverb for the wooden room, is just a way of suggesting the outdoor element. Long decay time, very wispy. I'll show you what it sounds like on everything. Sort of just a standard atmospheric ambience. And then I added a little bit of proximity on the whole thing, just to bring. It's actually the reverse effect of the other proximity. It's not bringing things further away. It's actually bringing them closer to your ear. So that's all the layers to this session. Like I said at the beginning, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free. I'll be reading all the comments on these lesson videos, so please feel free to leave a comment with a question, or if you'd like more detail on something, and I'll write back to you anything you want to know. Thank you again for supporting the channel. It's really humbling to have people on Patreon that want to watch these videos and that want to pay for them, so I'm really grateful for that, and I hope you enjoy the video lesson. I'm always trying to make these better, so because like I said, I kind of treat these more like we're hanging out and just talking, which is it can be a pro and a con for a video lesson, because it adds a lot of time, but it also allows us to get into detail and allows me to sort of tell you about everything about the session. So tell me what you like and don't like about the format. I'll do my best to listen to feedback and make these in the future sound really just be better than they are every time. So thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Tune in hopefully for the next waveform. Is going to be hopefully soon. And thank you for watching again. I'll head out here on just a couple of run-throughs of the entire sound again, and we'll call it a day. I'll include the temp music too, just for fun. Cool. All right. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.